So let's talk a little bit about the history of disenfranchisement. According to Jeff Manza in his study, we show that criminal disenfranchisement has its roots in Grecian and Roman laws, as well as in English and medieval laws. The removal of civil rights in those eras included total removal of citizenship from their nations. And if they had received this termination of citizenship, they could very well be killed because they were not considered part of the society as a whole. Fast forward to 19th century America, and you have the American Indian who's being disenfranchised from their land. They're being removed and told that they can't have their land anymore. They're being colonized, so to speak. Now you have European whites in this country, this North American continent, and they're colonizing it. And so then you have the war that takes place where America and Great Britain go to war. America is demanding their right to be free from a country that is holding them hostage and in bondage. And so you see this disenfranchisement going back and forth. And then we move into slavery, where you see blacks that are disenfranchised because now they are slaves. They're not even considered people. They're considered chattel or property, and they're sold as such. And so they're disenfranchised because they have no rights, because they are not considered citizens. After you leave the slave period, you get into post slavery. We have Abraham Lincoln signing the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And even though Mr. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, what many people do not know is that he did not free the slaves at that time. The freedom of the slaves was contingent upon the Union Army defeating the Confederate Army. So there was an irony in the Emancipation Proclamation, as Mr. Lincoln himself noted that he freed the slaves who were in the Confederate territories, again contingent upon the Union armies winning the war, but he did not free the slaves who were within the rank and file of the Union, the states that stayed faithful and stayed a part of the Union. And so now you have this law called the Emancipation Proclamation that many people say actually freed the slaves, when in reality it didn't. It was contingent upon, again, the Union Army winning the war against the Confederate. And we know that, thank God, the Union Army won, because here we are today, able to sit and to talk and to be a part of the American society. But it didn't come without blood, sweat, and tears, because even though the Emancipation Proclamation was passed, the 14th Amendment was passed, the 15th Amendment was passed, we see that Southern whites in particular were so anti-black that they implemented these laws called black code laws, and there was no meat in the 14th and 15th Amendment. And so blacks who were not supposed to be discriminated against because of the color of their skin or because of former servitude, in fact, were discriminated against. And some forms of disenfranchisement that they experienced at the hand of the Jim Crow South included polling taxes. These were taxes that were assessed on people who came to vote. And a lot of people don't realize that blacks were restricted in the amount of money they could even make because of some of the black code laws, so they couldn't afford to pay the polling taxes, but there were a few who could. And so of course, where they could, other disenfranchisement laws by the states were implemented. You had things such as grandfather clauses. In those grandfather clauses, you find where unless you were able to vote prior to the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, prior to the end of the Civil War in 1865, if you were able to vote prior to then in fact you could vote. But if you were not, then you could not vote. And so now, of course, who's left out of the loop? Blacks are left out of the loop because they cannot afford to pay the poll tax, let alone they were not given the right to vote. In my hand is a book by an author by the name of Jeffrey C. Stewart. And this book is called 101 Things Everyone Should Know About African American History. In reading some of the uh, chapters in this book, he goes into great detail about the disenfranchisement of blacks. And one of the things that he talks about uh, outside of the grandfather call clause and the polling tax was these understanding clauses. Within the understanding clause, a probable voter was supposed to read a segment of the state's constitution and then be able to explain it to the polling judge to their satisfaction. If the polling judge did not deem that they satisfactorily understood uh, that section of the state constitution, then in fact they could not vote. Finally, the last means of disenfranchisement, but surely not the only last means, but the last means of disenfranchisement that we will talk about in this context was in fact the white primaries. And so if blacks were able to pay the polling tax, if they were able to meet the grandfather clause or make those payments again of the polling tax, then in fact they were excluded again because the primaries were white only, and so blacks were not included. And so this is a historical context of disenfranchisement and how it has existed in America, and how blacks in particular have been disproportionately excluded from the body politic.